Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and colleagues around the world. My name is Larry Kelly, and welcome to the second session of the inaugural series of the World Affairs program of the MIT Club. I am thrilled to kick off our new program on the subject of world affairs, democracy, and freedom. The goal is to examine world affairs and to promote understanding and achievement of democracy and freedom. And I am especially thrilled and excited to have as our speaker today, Steve Pifer, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, to talk about the current situation in the Ukraine. By the way, our event today has over 150 registrations. Democracy is under pressure around the world. Just reading today's news would give one enough material to fill up all the time allotted for our event today. Here is a sampling. In Ukraine, Russia has used thermobaric weapons or fuel air bombs. With the exception of nuclear bombs, these are the most devastating bombs ever used by mankind. Reuters reports today that George Orwell's 1984, incidentally, set in an imagined future where totalitarian rulers deprive their citizens of all agency in order to maintain support for senseless wars, has topped the electronic bestseller lists in Russia. China, an unprecedented wave of protests has resulted in the government cutting away most of the tenets of its stifling zero COVID policies. Beijing is already experiencing a major COVID outbreak. Will the Chinese health system be able to handle this load? What happens if it cannot? In Iran, which is the only country to have gone through two revolutions in the past 100 years, there are large protests against repression by the morality police and over the dress code for women. The hijab has been called the flag of the Islamic Revolution. A well-connected cleric has likened it to the Berlin Wall, saying that knocking it down would signal the theocracy's collapse. Incidentally, Iran is cooperating militarily with Russia and is sending drones to Russia. To review our first event briefly, our speaker last month was Larry Diamond of Stanford, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, the founder of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. Larry gave a fabulous and thought-provoking talk on a global strategy to advance democracy in hard times. He highlighted many of the things that autocrats and dictators do to weaken and destroy democracy, as well as some ways to prevent such degradation in our own democracy. I am putting a link to Larry's talk, a recording of Larry's talk in the chat window now. You can download it and take a look at it at your pleasure, at your leisure. Today's speaker is Steve Pifer. Steve is an affiliate with Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, as well as a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. His interests are nuclear arms control, Ukraine, Russia, and European security. As a Foreign Service officer, Steve's more than 25 years with the State Department included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine, Ambassador to the Ukraine. Steve was the third ambassador to the Ukraine from the United States, and Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. Ambassador Pifer served at the U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as with the U.S. delegation to the negotiation on intermediate range nuclear forces in Geneva. Steve has offered commentary on NPR, PBS, CNN, Fox News, BBC, and the Voice of America. His articles have run in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, National Interest, Moscow Times, and Kyiv Post. His books include The Eagle and the Trident, U.S.-Ukraine Relations in Turbulent Times, as well as others. He has also written many articles on nuclear proliferation and arms control. Steve received his bachelor's in economics from Stanford in 1976. Now, Steve, that's the MIT of the West, right? So So I'm
We
putting
have better weather, though.
yeah, better weather here. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So I'm putting Steve's background and bio in the chat as well, and you can look those up. And one last housekeeping detail: we have also enabled live Q&A in the chat box, and I'll do my best to get to as many of these questions to Steve as I can during the Q&A session, along with many of the questions that we got from online registration. However, tonight's large audience will mean that we'll only be able to cover a small percentage of these during the live Q&A. And then I'll be back after Steve's talk to cover Q&A. Take it away, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Let me make sure I can share my screen here. Okay. All right. Okay, well, Larry, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak this evening. China is the big strategic challenge facing the United States in the next several decades, but there's only one country that could physically destroy the United States in a matter of hours, and that's not China, it's Russia. And it's Russia that has launched the largest and deadliest war that Europe has seen since World War II concluded in 1945. So I want to focus on that war. I want to look at what do Putin and the Kremlin want? How has the war played out over the last 10 months? I'll talk a bit about American policy, and if there's time, I'll offer some comments on some long-term implication of this. So let me begin by what do Putin and the Kremlin want? And first of all, let me say, it's really hard to read the Kremlin. It's a pretty opaque institution. But we can say that Vladimir Putin is the most powerful leader to sit in the Kremlin since Joseph Stalin died in 1953. Now, I do not believe that Vladimir Putin is a one-man show. I think there's an inner circle. But to the extent we understand that inner circle, there are people that come out of the security services, the KGB, and its Russian successor agencies, and they have a similar worldview and a similar outlook to Putin. Moreover, there really is no institutional check on this group. So from 1953 until the end of the Soviet Union, you had the Politburo. That institution appointed the general secretary of the Communist Party, who was the most powerful person in the Soviet Union. And on one occasion in 1964, the Politburo fired Nikita Khrushchev. There's no such mechanism in Russia that applies that same sort of check now on Putin. So what do Putin and that inner circle want? Let me describe 3 or 4 things that I believe are pretty high on their list. One is they're very interested in regime survival. That's job number 1 for the Kremlin. And since Vladimir Putin became president back in 2000, he's constructed what people call the power vertical, where all really important decisions are taken in the Kremlin. Now, early on, particularly in the early 2000s, the Russians tried to paint a democratic facade. So there is, for example, a systemic opposition. In the Federal Assembly, that's the Russian parliament, there is an opposition, a couple of opposition parties. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, a party which is neither liberal nor democratic. And these are categorized as opposition. However, on issues that really matter to the Kremlin, those parties line up with United Russia, that's the pro-Putin party, and vote in solidarity with them. So it's not a real opposition, it's not real politics. The real opposition is this guy, Alexei Navalny. The Russian government tried to poison him 2 years ago. When he returned after recuperating in Germany, he was immediately arrested, and I believe will be in jail as long as this regime is in power. But what the Russian government has done, working with the Duma, is they've passed a series of laws on foreign agents, undesirable organizations, extremist organizations that have been designed to compress the space for the non-systemic opposition, for people like Navalny. He headed an organization that followed corruption in Russia. That's now been declared an extremist organization, which means most of its senior people are now subject to arrest. They fled Russia. NGOs, independent NGOs have really been compressed, as has the independent media. And unfortunately, when you look at Russia today, it looks increasingly like the Soviet Union domestically. That's not a good thing. So regime survival. The second thing that I believe the Kremlin wants is they want a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, in part because they think that is just a facet of being a great power. And in the Kremlin, they see Russia as a great power. Now, when they talk about sphere of influence, what do they want? They want friendly governments. They want countries open to Russian business. But most importantly, they want governments that on big geopolitical issues, for example, relationship with the European Union, they will check back with Moscow and basically give the Russians a veto right. Now, there's some question, who's actually in this sphere? I think that for many in Moscow, they understand that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are now members of both NATO and the European Union, are probably out of the sphere, although I'm not totally sure that includes Vladimir Putin. So a third thing that the Kremlin and the inner circle want is they want a multipolar world where Russia is recognized as a great power and has a seat at the table, including, for example, here at the UN Security Council. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, often says no great issue can be decided around the world without Russia being there. And that's regardless of whether or not Russia can actually contribute to solving the problem at hand. And I believe that Russia's ability to act outside the post-Soviet outside the post-Soviet space is actually quite limited. And when they do, for example, in Syria, it tends to be destructive rather than constructive. And then the fourth thing I think the Kremlin would like to see is they're unhappy about how the post-Cold War Europe has evolved over the last 30 years. In particular, they're not happy with the enlargement of NATO or the European Union, and they'd like to figure out some way to undo that if they could. So I think those four things: regime survival, a sphere of influence, a seat at the table on big issues, and undoing the post-Cold War settlement, those all figure in a way into what we've seen the Russians doing to Ukraine over the past 10 months. Now, let me talk about the roots of the current war, which I actually say go back to 2013. And it's important to note that in 2013, Russia had in Ukraine a neutral country. Ukraine had passed a law in 2010 saying that Ukraine will have non-bloc status. And then Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, he didn't want to join NATO. He didn't want a membership action plan, but he did want to bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. And for years, the Russians had said they have no problem with that. In 2013, the Ukrainians had actually concluded an association agreement with the EU that included a free trade area, a customs union, and a series of law changes to Ukrainian law and regulation that would actually bring Ukraine's internal systems into conformance with EU standards and EU norms. And at that point, the Russians made very clear that they were opposed to Ukraine getting closer to the European Union. And a lot of pressure was applied to Yanukovych. The Russians threatened economic sanctions. They threatened to raise the price of energy they sold to Ukraine. They offered some inducements, some bribes. And literally about 7 or 8 days before Yanukovych was supposed to sign the association agreement, he says, we're going to delay that. And that evening triggers what became known as the Maidan Revolution. You had thousands of people that night showing up in Maidan Square in central Kyiv to protest the loss of their European vision. And over the next 3 months, that protest, which started with a few thousand, morphed into a much broader protest, sometimes bringing hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of Kyiv. And it was a protest against Yanukovych's growing authoritarianism and also Yanukovych's epic corruption. In late February, Yanukovych ordered his security forces to use force against the demonstrators. 100 were killed. And that provoked a miniature crisis. There was a quick negotiation, but then Yanukovych disappeared. And the next day, the Rada, that's Ukraine's parliament, they voted in an acting president and an acting prime minister. And acting president Turchinov and acting prime minister Yatsenuk said, our number one foreign policy goal is to bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. We want to sign the association agreement. And that, I believe, caused panic in the Kremlin. And very quickly, you saw Russian military forces with all of the insignia removed from their uniforms. There were no overt identifications, seized Crimea, the peninsula in the Black Sea. And then 2 months later, Russian security and military forces became involved in the fighting in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. There were efforts to try to solve the fighting in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, neither of which really succeeded. That fighting simmered. It wasn't a frozen conflict, it was a simmering conflict. And over the 8 years from 2014 up until February of this year, some 14,000 people were killed in that fighting. Moreover, something like 1.5 million Ukrainians fled the bright red area, the area occupied by Russian proxy forces. And in 2021, I would say the expectation was that this was going to be a steady state for Ukraine. Russia would insist on maintaining Crimea, which it had annexed, and then would use this simmering conflict in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. It could ratchet it up if it wanted to put pressure and try to destabilize the government in Kyiv, or it could ratchet it down. That all changed in February of this year, February 24, when the Russians launched a major invasion of Ukraine. Now, I think there are several factors behind this. Vladimir Putin gave two big speeches, one on February 21 and another on February 24, where he talked about his reasons for the war, none of which I think were very persuasive. He talked about the humiliation and genocide of the people in occupied Donbass. And very few people, while there was fighting there, would consider what was going on in occupied Donbass as genocide conducted by the Ukrainians. He talked about denazification of Ukraine, which was an interesting term, given that Ukraine is headed by a president who is Jewish, and its previous prime minister also is Jewish. And he talked about Ukraine seeking nuclear weapons, something that there was absolutely no evidence for. And it almost had the appearance that Putin was throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what would stick as he tried to come up with some reason for the war he launched. I actually think that there are really three factors that explain why the Russians went into Ukraine. One gets back to the sphere of influence. I think the Kremlin was getting very nervous that Ukraine was moving away from Russia and towards the West. But the irony there is that nothing is done more than Russian policy since 2014 to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West, the seizure of Crimea, and then Russian support for the conflict in Donbass. But it's not just geopolitics. I think an equally important reason is politics within Russia. And that is, for the Kremlin, a democratic, Western-oriented Ukraine with a robust growing market economy is a nightmare, because that kind of Ukraine is going to cause Russians to ask why they can't have the same political voice, the same democratic rights that Ukrainians have. And remember, job number one for the Kremlin is regime preservation. They don't want that upward pressure in Russia for democracy. And then the third factor is Vladimir Putin, who has a very distorted view of Ukraine and its history. Now, let me note that Ukraine and Russia have a history that goes back a long way. They both claim the Kievan Rus in the 10th century as their founding state. In Russia, they say Kyiv is the mother of all Russian cities. And part of this battle is a battle over history. And you have in Russia and Ukraine two countries whose culture, language, history is thoroughly intertwined. From 1654 until 1991, with the exception of a couple of chaotic years at the end of World War I, what is today most of modern-day Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire than the Soviet Union. But Ukraine was one of the constituent parts of the Soviet Union that in 1989, 1990 was pushing for independence. In 1991, there was a referendum in Ukraine. 92% of the population voted for independence. And in Crimea, and bear in mind, Crimea is the only part of Ukraine where ethnic Russians were a majority. Crimea, 54% of the population voted for independence. And from all the pieces of the Soviet Union, of the Russian Empire to lose, I believe that Ukraine mattered the most. And many Russians are not reconciled to that. That includes Vladimir Putin. If you look at the speech he gave on February 21, or an essay he published in the summer of 2021, this is somebody who does not accept the right of Ukraine to exist as a sovereign and independent state. And I believe the mask came off somewhat in June of this year. Putin was in St. Petersburg. He met with a group of young Russian entrepreneurs. And the question of Peter the Great's conquering of the Baltic states came up. And Putin said, no. Peter the Great didn't conquer the Baltic states. He returned to Russia historic Russia land. And then he went on to compare himself to Peter the Great. and said, what's going on in Ukraine? It's not conquering territory. We are restoring historic Russian lands. And I think that's something that we should be a little bit nervous about. Because if you look at where the Russian Empire was, at one point it included not only the Baltic states, but part of Poland and all of Finland. Let me note this is a war of choice. Ukraine in February posed no military threat to Russia. The Russian military budget was typically 10 to 12 times the size of the Ukrainian budget. And Russia in the last 15 years has thoroughly modernized their military, whereas Ukraine mostly had Soviet era equipment. Russia's, in terms of active duty personnel, the troop strength in this chart includes some reserves, but in terms of active duty personnel, the Russian military was 4 times larger, and Russia has about 4,500 nuclear weapons. Ukraine has none. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, actually Ukraine had what was then the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, and Ukraine chose to give those weapons up in large part because Russia, along with the United States and Ukraine, pledged in the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its independence, and its territorial integrity, and committed not to use force against Ukraine. So we're now in the 10th month of this war, and it's pretty clear the Russians are not succeeding. Vladimir Putin often says things are proceeding according to plan, which leads a lot of people in the West to wonder what the plan was. But in the first phase of the war, you saw this invasion coming out of the north, the east, and the south. And what it appeared was that the Russian military had 2 objectives. One was to seize Kyiv, the capital, fairly quickly, but also to occupy as much as the eastern 1/2 to 2/3 of Ukraine. And the Russian military utterly failed to achieve that. They reached the suburbs of Kyiv, but they did not enter the city proper for any length of time. And by the end of March, the Russians acknowledged. In fact, they withdrew from northern Ukraine. And at the end of March, they said, well, our goal now is to occupy all of Donbass. And so in early April, they were focusing really on the far eastern part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk regions. They did manage to capture most of Luhansk region after 3 months of very heavy fighting. But at the end of July, they weren't making much progress in Donetsk. And people at that point were thinking perhaps this war is going to settle down into a steady state fight, except what I would regard the 3rd phase began in September, where the Ukrainians launched counteroffensives, first up there in the northeast around Kharkiv. Ukrainian military forces pushed the Russians out of Kharkiv region and actually began to threaten an advance into the Luhansk region. And then down in the south around Mykolaiv and Kherson, the Ukrainians began a second counteroffensive, which began in October. But as you probably recall, in the middle of November, the Ukrainians succeeded in taking all of Kherson region that's on the west side of the Dnieper River. Now, the river's not on this map, but the Dnieper River roughly bisects Ukraine. And taking Kherson was important because that pushed the Russians. The Russians no longer have any military presence on the western side of the river. What we see now is the Russians seem to be preparing defensive positions, and the bulk of their offensive operations have shifted away from the Ukrainian military to really targeting civilian infrastructure, electricity, central heating, and water plants. And it looks like the Russian focus right now is trying to make life for civilians in Ukraine as difficult as possible, given that they have not had success the last 3 months on the battlefield. In September, we saw some signs that Putin was becoming a bit desperate. He had categorized this conflict as a special military operation. That was the Russian term to suggest it was of limited nature. And if you called it a war, you could go to jail. Russian journalists have gone to jail for using the term war. They were charged and convicted of discrediting the Russian military. In September, though, things got to a point where the mask slipped a bit, and what Putin did was ordered mobilization of 300,000 troops, about 77,000 of which are now reportedly either in or near Ukraine. And also in September, the Russians said they were going to conduct 4 referenda in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, the question being, do you want to join Russia? Now, these were bogus in every possible way. No illegal under international law, no credible observers, people having to vote under gunpoint, and no provision made for the millions of people to vote who had actually fled those areas when the Russians invaded. In any case, the Russians announced large majorities, 89 and 99%. My guess is those numbers were actually cooked up before the referenda. They launched that, and then they said on September 30th that they had annexed these four areas. They were now part of Russia. Even though the Russian military does not occupy all of those four territories, and about 2 days after they announced the annexation, Putin's spokesperson was asked to define exactly where the line was. He couldn't define exactly what they had annexed. And today, the Russian military controls less of that territory than they did on September 30th. I think the Russian aim here was to try to say, this is Russian territory. Ukrainians, you should stay away. And the Ukrainians, of course, ignored that. They pressed on with their counteroffensives. And as of today, or the end of November, they've liberated about 50 to 54% of the territory that the Russians occupied at the height of the Russian success in the spring of this year. Now, the Kremlin expected a quick win, I think, by all appearances. It didn't happen. And I think it reflects a series of miscalculations by the Kremlin. First of all, they did not believe the Ukrainians would fight. That, quite frankly, astonishes me. I was in Kyiv the last 2 days of January, so 3 weeks before the invasion. There was no doubt in my mind the Ukrainians were going to fight. Because for Ukrainians, this is an existential fight. They understand if they lose, their democracy's gone. Plus the vision that I believe drives a lot of younger Ukrainians in becoming a normal European state, that's also gone. Another underestimation by the Russians was they really, I think, failed to think outside the box as to what the Ukrainians might do. So in early October, although the Ukrainians have been careful not to claim credit, I think we all understand, the Ukrainians mounted a truck bomb attack on the bridge that links Crimea to the Russian mainland over the Kerch Strait. Later on in October, they used unmanned small surface vessels to mount a sea assault on Russian ships in Sevastopol harbor. And then last week, we saw them take 40-year-old drones and use them to attack two Russian bomber bases. So the Ukrainians are, I think, constantly surprising the Russians, and the Russians seem to be not thinking in a way as to how to deal with a foe who is prepared to do some things that are unpredictable. Another miscalculation by the Kremlin was to overestimate Russian military capabilities. First and foremost, we've all talked for many years about how corruption permeates the Russian economy and society. Well, there was no reason to think that the defense sector was immune. So the Russians have purchased many precision-guided munitions, many of which don't seem to hit their targets much of the time. I think the Pentagon assesses that some of the precision-guided weapons miss the target 60% of the time. And one example that we heard about 2 months ago, this is a Russian T-80 tank. Those plates along the side and along the turret and above the wheels, those are plates that contain explosive reactive armor. Now, what that does is an incoming shell that hits that, the explosive rearmor is designed to explode, but drive the force of the explosion and the incoming shell away from the tank and thereby protect the tank. Well, the Ukrainians captured one of these about 2 months ago, opened up one of the plates and said, look, it's not filled with explosive, it's filled with rubber. Rubber's a lot cheaper than explosive, but it doesn't protect the tank. And my guess is that somewhere in the tank industry, people basically filled these plates with rubber, thinking it would never be discovered or used, and that money was siphoned away, so that the Russian military, which has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in the last 15 years in modern equipment, I suspect is not getting nearly the bang that they expected for the rubles. Other miscalculations was to underestimate the Western reaction. The Russians saw a West that was divided, but in fact, NATO came together fairly quickly. You saw NATO providing first, relatively small man-portable weapons, but by May and June, providing heavy weapons. The top one there is a Caesar artillery piece with a very long range provided by France. And then you also have the HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket system, which the US provided beginning in June, and the Ukrainians have used to great effect to destroy Russian command posts and ammunition dumps. And that causes the Russians basically to push their logistics way back behind the front lines. Moscow did not anticipate the sanctions as they were applied. So had you asked Vladimir Putin on February 1, he would have said one of his assets was $630 billion in foreign currency reserves held by the Russian central bank. Unfortunately for Mr. Putin, more than half of those reserves are held in Western financial institutions. They've all now been frozen and are not available to the Russian government. And I actually very much hope that at some point the West will begin to move to seize those and use those as reparations to help rebuild Ukraine. But the other thing that hit the Russian economy hard was the cutoff of chips and semiconductors and a large variety of high-tech products. And that's had a real impact on production. Some of you may have seen the article about a week ago in the New York Times that talked about how Volkswagen had to shut down its plant because it couldn't bring in the inputs necessary to build cars in Russia. And that's across the board. I mean, the Russian car industry basically fell off a cliff beginning last spring. Trade is down. There was a report in October that said the number of containers passing through the St. Petersburg container terminal was 10% of what it had been a year before. And you've also seen a huge exodus by Western companies. More than 1,000 large Western companies have quit the Russian market. And it's not just energy companies and tech companies affected by sanctions. IKEA is not under sanction, McDonald's is not under sanction, but a lot of Western companies left because they concluded that the reputational risk of continuing to do business in Russia was too much. The impact of these sanctions, I think, is growing and will be felt as time goes on. Inflation right now is running about 13% in Russia, but also the Russian gross domestic product. It had a good year in 2021. It had a post-COVID bounce, but according to the Russian central bank, the Russian economy will contract by about 4% this year. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development agrees with that and says, moreover, the Russian economy will likely contract by 5.6% in 2023. So these sanctions, I think, are beginning to have an impact. They're having an impact more slowly than the West had hoped for, but they are causing some economic pain nonetheless. The one area that still is open is the West is trying to figure out how to sanction and basically get Europe off of Russian oil and gas. But as of December 5, Europe is no longer buying Russian oil. And they put into place, and we'll see if this works, a price cap on Russian oil, which they hope to enforce by the fact that most tankers that move Russian oil are flagged by European Union countries, and most companies that provide insurance for moving tanker loads of oil are European. And those tankers and those insurance companies will only haul Russian oil or insure it for oil that's priced at this point no more than $60 per barrel. So the idea is to cut the flow of revenues to Russia while still getting the oil to market. Why the miscalculations? First of all, I don't think the Kremlin understands Ukraine. And my one piece of evidence I'll offer for this is the last time that Vladimir Putin was in Kyiv was in 2013. And he gave a speech, and the high point of the speech was to say, we Russians and Ukrainians are one people. And he's repeated that numerous times since then. That's an utterly tone-deaf thing to say in Kyiv, because what Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians hear is you're denying my culture, my language, my history. Moreover, I think part of the problem is Putin operates in this very closed circle. I believe he does not get the information that a leader would need to make, the decisions with full information. I worry that this is an echo chamber, that people don't like to give the boss bad news. And what was a closed inner circle 3 years ago has become even more compressed by Kremlin and Putin concerns about COVID. So in the upper right there, that's Vladimir Putin meeting with his advisors on February 21. I think they're all about 40 feet away. Bottom left is 6 days later, where he's meeting with his defense minister and the chief of the general staff, presumably both of whom have been vaccinated. But again, that distance. So I worry that inner circle that he worked in has become even smaller, and that leads to bad decision-making. Finally, in Putin's case, I think this is somebody who's basically rational. He tries to make cost-benefit judgments. But my sense is over the last 15 years, he's become much more emotional. And when it comes to Ukraine, he's become angrier. And that has undermined his ability. It's clouded his ability to make the kinds of decisions that he should be making. So where does this thing go? I think it comes down to a lot, Vladimir Putin on the right, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, on the left. Ideally, the Kremlin would conclude that the costs of this war far outweigh the benefits. But we don't see that yet. And looking forward, I think there are two scenarios. I used to say there were three scenarios, but the scenario I've dropped is the scenario that I no longer see as possible is that Russian military regains its footing and actually succeeds in taking a large chunk of Ukraine, including the capital. And it just appears the Russian military does not have the capability to do that. So my own view is, however this war ends, at the end of the day, there's going to be a sovereign, independent Ukrainian state on the map of Europe, and it's going to be much larger than the rump state that the Russians intended to leave when they launched their invasion on February 24. The second scenario is that the Ukrainians win, that the Ukrainians continue the counteroffensives that they launched in September. And they have made very clear that, well, there's an expectation the pace of the conflict may slow down over the winter. They've made fairly clear that they intend to continue offensive operations into the winter. And what they aim to do is push the Russians out, or at least back to the line on February 23. I would like to see that happen. I'm not sure if the Ukrainians have the wherewithal, though, to sustain that kind of counteroffensive. So the third scenario, and in my view, what may be the most likely, is that, as the US intelligence community has been predicting since May, that this settles down into a war of attrition, where neither side has the ability to deliver a decisive blow, but the fighting continues and goes on perhaps months for months for months, some even suggest for years. And in that case, it would go on until there's really a point of mutual exhaustion, and then you might get a real negotiation. A negotiation can't happen now because the Russians still insist on maximalist demands that back in February were things like neutrality, demilitarization, denazification, acceptance of Crimea as part of Russia, recognition of the two so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. That was unacceptable to Kyiv back in February. They would have seen it as total capitulation. But what's been interesting in the last 3 months, while the Russians have been losing on the battlefield, the Russians have actually escalated their demands because they now expect the Ukrainians to recognize Russia's annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which is not going to happen. On the Ukrainian part, I think back in early March, the Ukrainians, Volodymyr Zelensky seemed truly pained by the fact that Ukrainians were getting killed each day. And they were trying to find a way to get to a negotiated settlement. They had offered neutrality. There were some hints, I believe, that suggested that they were even prepared to consider some territorial concessions. But that changed by the end of March. And it changed because as the Ukrainians drove the Russians out of northern Ukraine, as they liberated cities like Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, what they saw were the torture chambers, the mass graves, something like 500 people killed in Bucha alone. They saw the fact that there had been an organized effort by the Russians to remove Ukrainian children, to take them to Russia for adoption by Russian families. And the attitude hardened, both on the part of Zelensky, but also on the part of the Russian public. They saw after 3 months the assault on Mariupol, where the Russians reduced a city that was 90+% Russia speaking and 48% of the population were ethnic Russians, but they reduced the city to rubble after 3 months of assault. And I think at this point, Zelensky is not prepared to negotiate on the terms he was thinking about in March. And were he to be prepared to do that, he couldn't. The population would not let him do that. There was a poll that came out in October that said like 85% of the Ukrainian population wants to continue the fight and rejects negotiations. And there was just a new poll that came out that something like 84% of the population say the goal should be to drive the Russians out of all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. So there's not a lot of space there for negotiation now. And if in fact this is a war of attrition, it seems to me that's going to come down to, do the Russians, because of the impact of the economic sanctions, which I believe will bring increasing economic pain to a large number of Russians, but more importantly, this continued flow of casualties coming out of Ukraine, does that erode Russia's will to fight before economic difficulties and simply running out of weapons erodes Ukrainians' ability to fight? And the important thing here is the US and the West have a say in this. We can keep Ukraine in that fight. Let me talk for a bit about the Biden administration. A couple of months ago, it was reunion weekend at Stanford. Mike McFall, who runs the Friedman Spogli Institute, which is where my center is housed, he had several of us there to talk about different aspects of administration policy. We were asked to give the administration a grade. And so I was asked to grade Biden's policy on the Russia-Ukraine war. And I said, B plus, maybe an A minus, we're talking about grade inflation. The administration did a fabulous job on the diplomacy back in already in November, December of last year, is talking to allies. And, we saw the news coverage of the president's phone calls and Secretary Blinken, but what you didn't see was on each day, dozens of meetings and calls and Zooms between American diplomats and Europeans, and between the Japanese, South Koreans, Australians, and not only talking about what might happen and how the West should respond, but also a significant amount of intelligence sharing. I think really to an unprecedented degree, both sharing with allies and partners, but also making information public about Russian intentions. And that, I think, put us in a place that once Russia invaded at the end of February, very quickly you saw NATO move in terms of armed support for Ukraine. You saw the US and the EU come out with a list of sanctions. And so I think that's been fairly well done. Now, there is one red line that President Biden has declared, and I think most NATO members have, and it's the right one. It is that they're not prepared to provide American and NATO troops to defend Ukraine. And the reason I think that's the right one is I think right now Russia can lose this war, and it won't be existential for Russia. Set aside, it will not be good for Vladimir Putin's political prospects, but the Ukrainian army is not going to march on Moscow. Were the United States and NATO to enter the war with their troops on Ukraine's behalf, I think for many in Moscow, it would change how the war is viewed. It would be seen as existential, aimed not just at driving the Russians out of Ukraine, but at destroying or dismembering Russia. And I think at that point, the war can become very unpredictable. But on this side of that red line of no troops, I think that the administration, and this is why I would not give them an A, is I think that they have been trying to balance two objectives. On the one hand, they want to see Ukraine win. On the other, they don't want to have World War III between Russia and NATO. Those are two good objectives. But I think they come down a little bit too timid, a little bit too timid in terms of trying to avoid a war that I think is not a big concern. So I would actually advocate that the administration should be providing more weapons to Ukraine now so that they can build on the counteroffensive of the past several months and hopefully drive the Russians back. And to the extent that there are more battlefield defeats for Russia, that might change the calculation in the Kremlin. I don't think a drawn-out war is the best idea for Ukraine, certainly not for Ukraine, but I worry about if this war goes on for months and months and months, can we sustain political support in Europe, but also here in the United States for continuing to support the Ukrainians? So I would argue the West, we should stick with a very broad goal, that is to help the Ukrainians persuade Russia that the Russians cannot win. And what I mean as a Ukrainian win, it would be either the Russians withdraw completely from Ukraine, or Ukrainian battlefield progress sets up a negotiation that produces a settlement on terms that Ukraine can accept. And again, I think Ukraine can ultimately achieve that, provided the West can continue to support. Let me talk a little bit about long-term implications of this. And I've actually published a paper on the Brookings site about a week ago that looked at this. And where, again, I think there's going to be Ukraine on the map of the Europe, however this war ends, although I can't tell you exactly where the borders of that Ukraine will be. And I can't tell you specifically how the conflict's going to be settled. But I think that there are some things that even now we can say with a certain amount of confidence. I mean, first of all, for Ukraine, the war undoubtedly, it's been a tragedy. I mean, tens of thousands of Ukrainians, civilians, as well as military personnel have been killed. Huge damage done. I think estimates run from $300 to $500 billion in terms of what it would take to rebuild everything that's been destroyed in the war. And most of those estimates go back 3 or 4 months. But as I said, there's going to be Ukraine on the map. And one thing is, it's going to be a Ukraine that's more united internally. When I was in Kyiv in 2014 after the Russians seized Crimea and had gotten involved in the fighting in Donbass, the Ukrainian Fed said, Vladimir Putin has succeeded where centuries of Ukrainian nationalists have failed. And that is, Putin has created a sense of national identity in Ukraine and imbued it with a strong anti-Russian sentiment. That was in 2014. And I think that idea has only become stronger and stronger within Ukraine. And that sense of national identity now has been imbued with deep enmity towards Russia. That's going to take decades to overcome. Another Russian friend told me this summer, he said, when this war is over, you will see an effort in Ukraine to cancel Russian culture. All the little villages around Ukraine that have Pushkin squares, they're going to be looking to rename those. And it's already begun. Catherine the Great was the founder of Odessa. Odessa city voted last month to remove the big statue of Catherine the Great in downtown Odessa. So I think there's going to be enmity between Russia and Ukraine. That's going to be a negative for Russia for years to come. One bright thing for Ukraine is that this has actually opened up a prospect for Ukrainian membership in the European Union. For the last 30 years, up until 5 months ago, while the European Union was prepared to agree on relations with Ukraine and an association agreement, the European Union would never have agreed a language that said, if Ukraine does all the things that we expect of a prospective member, Ukraine can aspire to EU membership. In June, the European Union gave Ukraine the status of a candidate member and opened a door that had been closed for 30 years. Now for Russia, and this is what I focused on in the paper that I published for Brookings last week, the war's been a disaster. They've lost over 100,000 soldiers killed and wounded in action. That was a number as of a month ago. My guess is it's only gone up, particularly because there are lots of anecdotal reports of the mobilized forces going into action with very little equipment and very little training. And in a couple of cases, getting absolutely decimated by the Ukrainians. They've lost thousands of pieces of equipment. It will take the Russian defense budget years to rebuild and reconstitute what's been lost and expended in Ukraine. The Russian military reputation, I think, is something in tatters now. That will affect Russian arms sales in the future. And Russia is politically isolated. Vladimir Putin chose not to go to the G20 summit in Bali last month. I believe because he understood that had he gone there, he would have had very few bilateral meetings, and it would have been obvious that most of the other leaders were snubbing him. And you may have seen reports that Indian Prime Minister Modi declined to meet with Putin this year because Modi is upset both by the war, but also by some of the nuclear threats that were made in September. Looking at the economic implications, I think the Russians are going to face some economic difficulties that will go for many years. First of all, because they're cut off from high-tech imports, which they cannot replace domestically, the gap between the Russian economy in terms of high-tech, not only between the Russian economy and the West, but between the Russian economy and China is only going to grow. If, and it's still an if question, but if in fact Europe and others can cut themselves off of Russian oil and gas, it will have huge implications for Russia. And let me just show you this on the gas market. Yamal is the main gas producing field for Russia, Yamal, and to the west of that, Western Siberia. Russian pipelines are designed to export about 80% of the gas that comes out of Russia to Europe. Europe is hoping to get into a position fairly soon where it can cut itself off of Russian gas. The problem that the Russians have is they have A, limited capacity to produce LNG, but B, they don't have any pipelines that go from Yamal towards Asia. So they're not in a position easily to swing production from Europe to Asia. And again, if Europe can really cut itself off of Russian gas, it could be hugely damaging to the Russian economy for a long time to come. One other factor out there is brain drain. We saw already in February when the war began, large numbers of young Russians leaving Russia, including large numbers of people in the IT world, because basically due to sanctions, they could not continue to work for Western companies from Russia. They're now in places like Georgia and Kazakhstan, and in some cases, the Baltic states. And that brain drain or that exits of people only accelerated after the announcement of mobilization in September. Now, looking at Europe, I think the Russian invasion, this has been a game changer for Europe. The biggest example being what Germany calls the Zeitenwende, the turning point. If you look at what happened in a couple of weeks at the end of February and the early part of March, the German government shut down, it said it would not certify the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, accepted sanctions that many felt the Germans would not agree to, announced it was going to add 100 billion euros, that's about $110 billion to defense spending, and would quickly come up to the goal of 2% of defense spending set by NATO, and announced it was going to buy American F-35s to sustain a dual capable aircraft to sustain Germany's role with a nuclear delivery aircraft for American provided nuclear weapons. NATO's rearming, the expectation is by 2024, 2/3 of NATO members will have hit the goal that was agreed back in 2014, which is that countries by 2024 spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense. NATO is building up its military on the eastern flank. What it used to have, which were, well, from 2014 on, were basically tripwire forces. Those are getting bolstered. Early next year, Finland and Sweden will be accepted into NATO. 28 of 30 NATO members have now approved their accession. Turkey and Hungary are expected to act early in 2023. And that basically takes the Baltic Sea and turns it into a NATO lake. That's not been, these geopolitical developments have been, I think, very negative for Russia. Just a couple of comments what it means for U.S.-Russian relations. I hope we'll be able to manage differences, maybe do some arms control, because both sides seem to think that there's some value in containing the nuclear aspect of their competition. But quite frankly, it is hard for me to see us getting back to anything that looks like normal with Russia until Vladimir Putin is gone. Now, let me be clear here. I am not advocating an American policy of regime change. I don't think we know how to do that. American policy should remain to try to encourage a change in Kremlin policy, not a change in the Kremlin regime. But as a practical matter, as an analytical matter, it's very hard for me to see how we get back to a better place with Russia while Putin is in the Kremlin. And it's going to require that the people who come in behind him then make some changes to show that Russia, in fact, is prepared to live in a peaceful way with its neighbors. So I don't know when the war is going to end, but I do think, ultimately we'd like to bring the Russians to accept this. This was a picture that was posted by the Canadian mission at NATO back in 2014, except that there is a neighbor and it's not Russian territory. But even if we don't know exactly how the war is going to conclude, I think that there are some ramifications that already are apparent that are going to be felt for many years. And many of those ramifications are extremely negative for Russia, no matter how the war specifically turns out. So let me stop at that point. I would be happy to take questions.
Oh boy, that was just fabulous. That was just absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
We have a lot of questions. There's a couple of fairly large ones, large in terms of scope, and I've tried to organize them. There's a bunch of smaller ones that lead into the bigger one, and maybe if we tackle the smaller ones, the scope of these questions that are smaller in scope first, it will lead to the larger one later. This isn't in any particular order. I'm not clever enough to organize these in order in such short time in real time. So what are the prospects for Belarus in general and Moldova? Are they likely to become part of the fighting?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd break it. I think two very different things. I mean, first of all, Moldova actually has had a frozen conflict going back to 1993 or 1994. So it has the breakaway region of Transnistria, which is a very thin sliver of land between the rest of Moldova and Ukraine.
Right.
The Moldovans have made pretty clear they would like to have a path towards the European Union. They're getting support from Romania. And I think the Moldovans are very sympathetic towards Ukraine, but they don't have the capability to get involved in this. Belarus is in an interesting situation. The Belarusians, their president Lukashenko, who I believe owes a lot to Putin.
Right.
Remember, Lukashenko had an election 2 years ago. He claimed to have won. Virtually nobody believes that. But Lukashenko stayed in power because it has a very strong internal security section. And the Russians are the ones who've been supporting him. So on the one hand, Lukashenko wants to be responsive for Putin and allowed Russian forces to use Belarus as a jumping on point in February for their invasion and the effort to capture Kyiv. But I think he's also been very careful not to get the Belarusian military involved. And my guess is that the Belarusian general staff does not want to go to war against Ukraine. And Lukashenko probably understands that sending the Belarusian army into battle would only increase his domestic problems.
Right. Yeah, good. So let me combine a couple of questions here. They have to do with Crimea. One barrier to peace is the question of which nation claims Crimea. Is there a possible solution where Crimea becomes an independent state, constitutionally prohibited from joining NATO or CSTO? And somewhat related is, what's the current state of CSTO, both with Russia's weakened power and the total lack of response to Armenia's request for military intervention?
Yeah. I think in terms of the territory that Russia now occupies, Ukrainian territory, I think Crimea means more to them than Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson.
Right.
It's very hard for me to see Putin agreeing to either give Crimea back or even to accept the idea of Crimea as an independent state. So I think if or when they get to a negotiation, however long down the path that may be, Crimea is going to be a very difficult issue. And it will be harder than, like I said, the other territorial questions.
Yeah.
Militarily, I mean, this is one, I think it would also be the toughest nut for the Ukrainians to crack militarily, because basically the peninsula is joined to the mainland by a stretch of land that's only about 4 to 5 miles wide. And the Russians can really fortify that. I mean, if there's going to be a military assault on Crimea, the Russians know where it's coming from. Now, another question, could the Ukrainians somehow isolate Crimea, attack the bridge here, so things like that? But I think that's a longer term proposition.
It's said that you need 3 to 4 times as many offensive troops as defensive troops in order to take, to invade. Yeah.
But one of the advantages, I mean, right now the front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces is probably 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers long, stretching all the way from Luhansk in the north down to Kherson. And that's given the Ukrainians the ability to surprise the Russians. The Russians clearly did not did not expect the counteroffensive that took place in Kharkiv in the north back in September. The Ukrainians were actually fairly obvious they were going after Kherson. But when you have that long front, you have the ability to kind of pick where you are and surprise the other person. They would not have that kind of ability to surprise if it was going after Crimea.
Yeah, not in Crimea.
Yeah. The Collective Security Treaty Organization has always been, I mean, it was a Russian creation because the Russians wanted to have something that they could say was their NATO.
Right.
And I believe most members, with Armenia probably being an exception, and maybe Belarus, but Kazakhstan, I mean, Uzbekistan joined and then suspended its participation. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan are, I think, kind of there because the Russians want them to be there. The Armenians are frustrated because the CSTO, which has an article, NATO's Article 5, an attack against one will be considered attack against all. The CSTO treaty has an Article 4, which is very similar, and Armenia says, well, we've been assaulted now by Azerbaijan, although Azerbaijan is basically trying to regain territory that Armenia took 30 years ago. and the CSTO has done nothing. And it was such a point of frustration that the Prime Minister of Armenia at the CSTO summit meeting in November refused and blocked the signature of a final declaration. Kazakhstan, it's been mentioned, Kazakhstan has increased its defense spending. And there's a report that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are talking about some kind of a bilateral defense arrangement, which suggests that the Kazakhs, may not have that much confidence in CSTO, but it also raises the question, if Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are talking about bilateral defense arrangements, who are they worried about? And my guess is perhaps Russia. One of the Russian television pundits several months ago said, well, you know, after we get done with Ukraine, northern Kazakhstan really is mostly filled with ethnic Russians, and maybe we ought to get a piece of that territory back as well. So I don't see the CSTO as a very serious organization. That they have all but begged over the years for some kind of relationship with NATO, and NATO just kind of ignores them. NATO doesn't want to give them legitimacy of having any kind of a formal relationship, and I think that's probably the right attitude.
What do you think of the odds of this becoming a nuclear war?
Not zero, but very small.
Very small.
Putin and Putin made a number of nuclear threats back in September. And it goes back to when he announced the annexation of the 4 Ukrainian provinces, oblasts. He said, well, these will be part of Russia, and we will defend them with all means at our disposal, which people said, okay, is he making a nuclear threat there? Now, I think the nuclear threat didn't work. Remember, Putin doesn't want a nuclear war. He wants the West and Ukraine to be afraid that Russia is ready for a nuclear war as a mechanism to get the Ukrainians to capitulate and the West to end its funding and its supply of arms to Ukraine. But it's become pretty clear that, one, it didn't have any effect on the Ukrainians. I mean, if the Ukrainians see themselves now as in an existential fight, the nuclear dimension is not going to push them to concede.
Doesn't matter.
The West responded. I thought West's response was a little bit shaky at first, but came back and said, if the Russians use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, there will be severe, serious consequences. And properly then did not say anything more publicly. They let the Russians figure it out. But I think the fact that may have been particularly troubling to the Russians is both the Indians and the Chinese. President Xi himself came out against this. And I think if you're in Moscow, if you consider using a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine, you'll lose India for sure, you'll lose China very likely, and you're going to lose the global South. You know, right now, Russia is isolated from the West, but most of the countries in the South have tried to kind of sort of stay out of this. It's not their fight. My guess is, though, if the Russia were to escalate to a nuclear weapon in a war that the Russians started but could not win at the conventional level, Putin would find himself really a global pariah. And I even think I wrote an article for Stanford a couple of weeks ago on this. If you look at the last 2 months, it seems to me that the Kremlin has tried to ratchet down the nuclear rhetoric. It started, there's this thing called the Valdai Discussion Club. It's a group that used to have a lot of Western think tank people, very few Western think tank people. Now it's mainly the global South. And Putin really ratcheted down the nuclear rhetoric there. He said, you know, we've never made any threats of first use of nuclear weapons. These are all made by our opponents in the West who are trying to, you know, besmirch Russia's good name. A few days after that, the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a statement on prevention of nuclear war, which said all of the right things. After the Russian foreign minister met with his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese counterpart came out and said, yes, Foreign Minister Lavrov understands that any nuclear threat is unacceptable and inadmissible. So I think the Russians came to a conclusion in October that the nuclear threats were not working either in Kyiv or with the West, and that they were making China, India, and the global South nervous. They were being counterproductive, and they tried to sort of ratchet it down since then. So yeah, I don't totally exclude that, but I think it's very, very unlikely.
There was a lot of talk about conversations happening on back channels, and perhaps some of what you're describing is a consequence of that?
Well, I wouldn't say it was back channels. I mean, both Secretary of Defense Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Milley had conversations either at the end of September, early October, with their Russian counterparts.
Yeah.
And my guess, I mean, we haven't seen the transcript and no one's given much detail, but my guess is they were saying, look, guys, we're professional military people. You know as well as we do that once somebody uses a nuclear weapon, the Pandora's box is open and nobody knows where that leads to.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I remember that. I thought there was a report that came by that said there was a conversation between some of us in the West, and I'm not sure whether it was Americans or not,
Yeah.
that said, we'll come in and knock out your electric grid, and we'll knock out your Navy and maybe a few other things.
There were some press reports that said things, big sanctions. I mean, what the press reports seemed to agree on was that if there was a Russian nuclear use against Ukraine, there would not be a Western nuclear response. But
Yeah.
there was talks of sanctions up to, you know, a major conventional attack by NATO forces on Russian forces in Ukraine. And again, I mean, all speculation. I think the proper way was done by the administration was just say there will be severe consequences, period.
Right.
Let the Russians figure out exactly what that might mean.
Yeah. Strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
It will. Yeah. I think we covered that. What is there a way to get real information to the Russian people, and how would you topple institutionalized dictatorships with entrenched security apparatus?
Yeah, that's hard, which is why I say I don't think the United States should have a policy of regime change. I think it would be very difficult.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think we actually understand the Kremlin enough. One of my friend and a former colleague served as ambassador a few years ago to Moscow, and he said, you know, it's actually harder to understand the Kremlin now than it was back in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
Because in the 70s, 80s, we had one thing every year. You had the Great October Revolution Parade when the whole Politburo lined up on Lenin's tomb. You know, and people could say, oh, look, this guy there, he's now moved 2 more spots closer to the center than he was last year. He's on the upswing. You know, we don't have that now. So we can't do it.
Yeah.
Information space. I mean, Russians who want to have access to Western information, they can use VPNs and things like that and get access to social media. But the Kremlin's tried very hard to close the information space in Russia. And I would think that would actually be one thing where some really smart people in the cyber world, you know, if we could find a way to knock that down, and helping Russians understand just what's happening. Although my guess is now that the casualties are probably strong enough, particularly in Russian cities and towns where units were based in peacetime.
Right.
You know, some of these places, they've seen several hundred coffins come home.
Wow.
And my guess is there is an understanding there that this war is going in a fairly negative way.
Yeah. What about resistance and partisan warfare in the occupied lands and maybe even in Russia?
Yeah, there has been some Melitopol, which is sort of midway between the Sea of Azov, which is to the northeast of Crimea, and the Ukrainian-Russian front lines. There's been a lot of partisan activity there. But also there are lots of reports that, again, and I think it's one of the things that makes the life of Russian occupiers very difficult, is most of the local population, if they're still there, there's a lot of people reporting back to Ukrainians about where the Russians are.
Mm-hmm.
So that, again, when the use of the HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket systems, have been pretty devastating. The Ukrainians have been very effective at using them against ammunition dumps, with the result that the Russians have to push the ammo dumps 30 to 40 miles back away from the front line to protect them. Mm-hmm. And also where troop formations are located. And they're also aided sometimes by Russians. I mean, Russian media several times has posted either live or real-time pictures, right? And somebody's gotten on there and geolocated exactly where the site was, and the Ukrainians have been able to strike it.
Yeah, there was some comment about this, one of these most recent strikes in the last week or two, where the son of the guy that runs the Wagner Group, yep. Wagner Group was did a selfie and
outside a building, and the Ukrainians had some evidence that there was a group there, and they were able to use that as the final piece of evidence to say that's where Wagner is, and HIMARS rocket arrived on it fairly shortly thereafter.
Yeah. So what about the role of the Wagner Group, and where do you see them headed?
Yeah, the Wagner group is, to my mind, it's another example of the Russians importing and using the bad American idea. You know, we unfortunately in Iraq and Afghanistan became reliant on, you know, sort of private military groups like BlackRock, and the Russians followed suit.
Mhm.
It's interesting to me watching the Wagner group, headed by this guy named Prigozhin,
Mhm.
who sometimes call close to Putin, called Putin's cook.
Right.
I guess they knew each other from back in St. Petersburg. Um, but it's interesting. They've now spent 3 months attacking Bakhmut, a town in Donbass. As far as I can see, there's no strategic significance to Bakhmut. But it looks like the Wagner group has become so intent on capturing it that the Ukrainians are thinking, yes, fine, as long as they want to do that, we're going to use this as a place basically to inflict casualties on the Russians. So for 3 months now, they've been fighting this pitched battle where the Ukrainians are fighting from defensive positions for a place that doesn't mean very much. But again, this is my guess. I think Prigozhin, who talks about taking Bakhmut, he wants to be able to do that, say, look, I was able to capture the city, which again has no strategic relevance, in contrast to the regular Russian military, which has been retreating. And this may be about him positioning himself vis-a-vis Putin and the Kremlin as much as anything. There is no love lost between Wagner Group and the Russian military. You may have seen this report back in, it was 2018. We're in Syria. There are some American forces were operating in eastern Syria, and a group approached this. And my understanding is 3 times there's an American-Russian deconfliction phone line set up to keep Americans and Russians away from direct fighting one another. And what I was told is when we make a call, it never rings more than 3 times before it's answered. Well, apparently 3 times the Americans called Russia and said, we see this group. We are going to take action against it because it's threatening one of our units. Is it yours? And 3 times the Russian military response was not ours. And the group didn't stop coming, and it was hammered out, several hundred Russians killed in the Wagner group. And so you had this wonder, I mean, the Russian military, could have done something and chose not to, and chose to let the American military do its thing. Yeah. So I don't think there's a lot of love lost between those 2 groups.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, interesting. So potentially there's other divisions within Russia.
Yeah,
as well.
And Prigozhin has been fairly critical of the Russian military leadership. So again, that's another reason why there's not great affection between the 2.
Right. What's the current state of the cyber war, and who might be involved? It seems like cyber war is almost the opposite of kinetic war. It's cyber war. You want to be slow, methodical, behind the scenes, invisible.
Yeah.
And once you go to kinetic, not much you can do. Not much.
Yeah, it was puzzling. I mean, because the cyber war has, it's like the dog that didn't bark in the night.
Yeah.
Now, one speculation was you didn't see Russian cyber operations early on because, again, people smarter about the cyber will say that actually to do cyber operations, they can take months and months of preparation. And, the idea that the Russian army was going to invade on February 24 was a closely guarded secret until the very end. So the cyber guys may not have had time to prepare the sorts of campaign that they would like to do had they had more time to prepare. But also, it's my understanding that the Ukrainians are actually also pretty smart in the cyber world. They've been working hard on defense, and I've been told that they're getting a lot of support both from Western cyber specialists, both military, but also there are a number of private companies, including Silicon Valley companies, that are providing a lot of assistance to the Ukrainians on this. So they have a lot of help on the defensive side.
Putin's health. Lots of rumors about Putin's health. What do you think?
Rumors? Lots of rumors. I've yet to see a report by anybody, a doctor who actually examined Putin or seen his medical records. So I don't think we know. Bill Burns, a friend of mine, a retired Foreign Service officer, is now the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. he got this question a few months back, and he said, as far as he can tell, Putin is entirely too healthy.
Too healthy.
Yeah.
Too healthy. So here's a question that's come in, and let me read it to you because it's involved. It says the Jeff Berner submitted this, and he says, Timothy Schneider from Yale postulates that members of the European Union, France, UK, and Germany, had to undergo military losses, giving up their overseas territories before changing from imperialism, and that Russia has yet to undergo such losses, and thus will not change from imperialism as a source of foreign policy until it loses wars in Ukraine and Georgia. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I guess I don't consider myself an expert on the collapse of empires, but Zbigniew Brzezinski used to say, Russia has a choice. It can try to be an empire, or it can be a normal state.
Yeah.
If it tries to be an empire, it's going to have a hard time having a normal relationship with the rest of the world. And again, if you look at what they're doing, I mean, this looks pretty imperial. Now, the other question is can Russia divorce itself from aspirations to take parts of Kazakhstan or Ukraine or Georgia? But then some actual question, when you talk about empire, is then just the Russian Federation, is itself an empire? I mean, Russia itself has probably 100 different ethnic nationalities. Ethnic Russians are probably about 80% of the population, but that's changing. If you look at birth rates in Russia, I mean, in Moscow, if you're talking about ethnic Russians, it's barely a replacement rate. Where the birth rates are off the charts are places like Tatarstan, which is Muslim, or Chechnya.
Mm-hmm.
So, some years down the road, Russia will be ethnically less Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not smart to say what that impact will be, but I think it's going to have an impact. I just don't know what it is. And I guess the Kremlin, I think, ought to be mindful of one thing is, anecdotally, the evidence suggests that based on the units that were originally set in, that the casualties are falling disproportionately higher on people like the Buryats from Siberia, and the Tatars and the Chechens than on ethnic Russians. And I think if that is true and it gets out, that's potentially a real time bomb within Russia.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah. So, somewhat related, I mean, if the objective is that we would like the countries of the Russian Federation, or the Russian Federation itself, or that part of the world to become a normal state, as you say, and become a democracy, doesn't it take a couple of generations of development? I mean, there's no history of free markets, of freedom, of the rule of law, and so forth in this part of the world. Is that true? I mean, nobody grows up with those expectations and understanding how to work in that kind of a society. Is that true?
I mean, the problem I think in Russia is, I mean, Russia, a badly flawed democracy, but there was democracy in Russia in the 90s. The problem was it was also a time when great economic dislocation in Russia, loss of empire. Mm-hmm. And so, Putin came into power in 2000 saying, I want to restore stability. And that played very well. And I remember, I guess one of the last times I was in Moscow and I was still in the government in 2004, meeting with the Moscow Helsinki Commission. And these are impressive people, several of them who spent years in the Gulag. And I asked them, I said, in Ukraine, I see a bottom-up push for democracy. You see it in Georgia. I said, I don't see it in Russia. And they agreed. I said, when do you get a push by Russians for real democracy? And in 2004, the speculation was, well, once economic circumstances become better, once people are better off economically, then they can turn their attention to politics. But by 2008, the situation was, the economy was a lot stronger, and we didn't see that push. So I'm not sure what it takes to get the kind of bottom-up push for democracy in Russia that you saw in the Baltic states all the way back in the early 90s, that you saw in Ukraine, both in the Orange Revolution in 2004, the Maidan Revolution in 2013, 2014. In Georgia, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't rule it out, but I think it's going to be a while. It's going to be a long path before Russia becomes what I would describe as sort of a more normal state.
yeah, I don't know so much about Georgia and Ukraine and Belarus, but the Baltic states, I mean, they have a tradition of capitalism and free enterprise dating back to the Hansa League.
Yeah,
Right?
and I guess in the case of Ukraine, you could say Western Ukraine had some of that experience.
Yeah.
But the bulk of Ukraine, Eastern and Central Ukraine, was kind of in the same boat as the Russians.
Right.
But
right.
I don't know whether it's the warmer climate or I think proximity to Europe helped, but for some reasons, the Ukrainian population is much more interested in having a political voice than their Russian counterparts seem to be.
So you're thinking it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my guess is, I mean, if Putin is replaced, the person who comes in behind him is going to look a lot more like Putin than, say, a Gorbachev.
Yeah.
But, if Putin's replaced by the inner circle, I mean, the good thing is he'll be replaced because they're looking to get out of Ukraine.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So here's a tougher question, right? Yeah. There are some pundits among us who advocate lengthening the war to weaken Russia as much as possible, in the expectation that Russia would not thereafter be able to start additional conflicts. There are others among us who advocate ending the war as quickly as possible so that the Russian Federation does not fragment into many states, some of whom might descend into chaos and war across the Caucasus. This particular nightmare scenario could result in nuclear weapons and material available to the highest bidder. What's your thought on that? What's the best answer between those two extremes? And that sort of presumes Russia is going to lose this war.
Yeah. No, my answer would be is I think we should be doing what we can to help the Ukrainians create circumstances on the battlefield that lead Russia then to seek an end to the war, where the Russians are prepared to negotiate in a serious way.
And stay together.
I mean, the breakup of the Soviet Union was actually, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, look what happened in Yugoslavia.
Oh yeah, sure could have. Yeah.
And I'm not sure that the breakup of Russia would be in the American national interest. I mean, I don't want to negotiate with a nuclear armed Tatarstan. So I don't think we haven't necessarily mentioned that. The idea of drawing the war out simply to weaken Russia, I think, is immoral. I mean, because that means we're fighting with Ukrainian lives now. Again, it's a battle the Ukrainians want to fight. My guess is if the West tomorrow cut off all weapons to Ukraine, Ukrainians would continue to fight, even if it came down to Molotov cocktails and rocks. But I don't think we should be trying to lengthen the war simply to draw down the Russians. Quite frankly, I think the Russians, because of the ill-advised decision by Putin to invade, they've already done a huge amount of damage to themselves. And it was a country that I would argue was already in decline. If you look at Russian demographics, if you look at the economy, it was in decline. They've accelerated that. I don't think we need to do anything more on that. The goal should be to try to end the war as quickly as the Ukrainians can either get the Russians out or get to a point where they can negotiate a settlement that they can accept.
So the stock market people say that there's such a thing as a dead cat bounce.
Yeah.
The market goes down, it hits a bottom, and then there's some buying pressure, it goes back up a little bit, and it's a dead cat bounce, and you shouldn't buy in that. It'll continue to get. Maybe you're familiar with that expression. I'm sorry.
I heard the concept. Yes.
Yeah. Is that what we're seeing with Russia? Is this a dead cat bounce? As you suggest, the country's been declining for some time. Is this a last gasp kind of phenomenon?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say in that had Boris Yeltsin chose somebody else to be his successor and then go into an election with the administrative resources of the Russian state behind him, somebody other than Vladimir Putin, my guess is we probably wouldn't be here. I mean, the three factors I named, geopolitics, Russian politics, domestically, and Putin, I think if Putin was removed from the equation, we might not be in this state.
Yeah. So maybe that's the answer to this next question, which, and we're getting close to the end here. how can it be ensured that the war ends in a true peace and not a frozen conflict or truce that would require a permanent war footing?
Yeah.
Maybe you're saying the answer to that. One answer to that is Putin's got to go.
Yeah, or again, I mean, I could conceive of, I think it's small probability, a settlement that the Ukrainians accept that somehow Putin portrays as a victory where he could remain in office, but I think that that's quite unlikely. What I would be very leery of if I were the Ukrainians is accepting an open-ended ceasefire. I mean, that's what basically happened in Donbass back in 2014 and 2015. And, it was pretty clear the Russians did not intend to return the territory. So if I were in Kyiv, I would worry that a ceasefire would begin to lock in territory as Russian, but also that the Russians would use the time to try to reconstitute their force and prepare for another offensive. And this is, I think, is something that almost regardless of how the war ends, I think Kyiv has to assume that there's going to be a hostile Russian neighbor. And so I think if I were the Ukrainians, I mean, the Ukrainians say they would like to join NATO.
Yeah.
I have a hard time seeing how 30, soon to be 32 countries agree to say yes, because that means that those countries are prepared to commit their forces to fight Russia for Ukraine. And I think that's not going to happen in the near term. I tried to argue Ukrainians that they're better off asking the West to provide them with the weapons so that they can defend themselves after this war is settled. And my guess is that Washington, London, Paris, Western capitals would be much more prepared to provide weapons to Ukraine than say, yes, we're prepared to give you that security commitment that a NATO guarantee would be.
Right.
But I think almost regardless of that, Ukraine is going to have a stronger defense, one that would be capable of deterring the Russians from trying something like this ever again.
Yeah. Yeah. So permanent war footing then.
So they said they're going to have to be like Israel, at least for the near term, so that the Russians understand that the war would be very, very painful again.
Yeah, good comparison, Israel.
Try to deter. The point is to deter the Russians from doing this again.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, Steve, this has just been fabulous. I'm just so thankful that you've been able to make some time and help us all understand what's going on there. Any closing comments that you have?
I think I've pretty much said what I needed to say.
Yeah, yeah. This has just been great. Things are moving very quickly on many fronts in the Ukraine. It seems like there's a new development every day and new events. And in fact, a lot's changed since I heard you first give this talk in October. And this has been very enlightening.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think for the people of Ukraine, it's going to probably continue for quite some time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and perspectives. This has been like getting a proverbial drink of water from a fire hose, and it's been a great, terrific evening and talk. Thank you so much for your participation and support of our program. I hope we could have you come back again. Maybe sometime down the road where there's more resolution to this conflict.
Let's see. That's how I would like to see some resolution to this conflict.
Yeah, a positive resolution. And the other thing is you've been in the thick of it for more than 25 years, and you know your way around. You know all the subtle nuances, and I want to thank you for your service to our country. I mean, it's just been phenomenal what you've been able to do.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say, 90% of the time I enjoyed it. I had fun doing it. Wish we could have been a little bit. I mean, back in the 90s when I was at the White House, we thought that there was a chance both to, build a more stable, secure Europe, but also to engage Russia in a way. And unfortunately, we did not succeed in our ambitions then.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. To our audience, thanks for the astute questions. There were lots of them, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but hold on, we're not finished yet. We have two upcoming events. First, on Saturday, January 28th, the club is hosting the MIT Human Factor Conference. One of the presenters at this conference is Professor Adam Berinsky from Course 17. Okay, if you don't remember, that's the political science department. Professor Berinsky will lead a session entitled Political Rumors, Why We Accept Misinformation and How to Fight It. Let me put the URL for that in the chat right now. As you've seen from Larry Diamond's talk last month and from Steve's talk today, misinformation is one of the tools that bad actors use to harm democracy. Adam will give us an in-depth look at misinformation, and I encourage you to sign up for this conference. Then on Tuesday, February 21st, Karis Templeman will address the question of whether peace can be preserved across the Taiwan Strait. Karis is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a lecturer at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford, and has just returned from Taiwan. His area of expertise includes democratic transitions and consolidations, comparative parties and elections, and the politics of Taiwan. Taiwan lies at the heart of the growing confrontation between the United States and the People's Republic of China, also known as the PRC. And this confrontation remains the only issue that could plausibly trigger a war between our two countries. Karis's talk will cover how the US PRC Taiwan relationship got to this point, what each side's foremost interests and long-term strategies have been, and where they are headed, and what approach might best ensure peace across the Taiwan Strait for the foreseeable future. And once again, a final thank you to Steve Pifer. Thanks so much for this excellent presentation. And also, go Warriors, go Niners, and hey, Niner fans, how about that Brock Purdy? Have a great evening and a great holiday season. Good night to everyone.